The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche noted that the question, "Who are the Germans?" will never cease to be relevant. Throughout history, the Germans' answer to the questions, "Who are they?" and "Where are they going?" has been determined by the ambitions and policies of German leaders at different stages of the country's historical development. Often, these answers posed a threat to Germany's neighbors and the entire European continent. They are encapsulated in succinct and telling vocabulary that recorded dangerous vectors in German policy for other countries. Drang nach Osten, drive to the east. Germany, wake up. The call of pan-Germanists. Germany's future lies on the seas. The slogan of Emperor Wilhelm II, and later Third Reich, Mein Kampf, Blitzkrieg, and total war. These words became symbols reflecting the threat that German policy posed to its neighbors. But such challenges did not go unanswered. The reaction to them was the Treaty of Versailles, the Eastern Front, the anti-Hitler coalition, battles from Stalingrad to Normandy, the victory banner over the Reichstag, the Potsdam Agreement, and, ultimately, the Nuremberg trials. This confrontation eventually changed Germany itself, giving its people a chance to rethink and overcome the legacy of the past. Thus, after World War II, Germany found itself divided into two opposite parts. On one side, the Federal Republic, building a capitalist state, and the German economic miracle. On the other, the German Democratic Republic, a socialist state under the strict control of the USSR with strict internal oversight measures. These two worlds were not just divided by a border, they were separated by different values, laws, culture, and, most importantly, different visions of the future. After World War II, Germany found itself in a deep crisis, and the question, "Who are the Germans and where are they going?" arose with renewed urgency. However, this time, the Germans did not have a say in answering it. Unlike the victorious countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the USSR, the Allies faced a difficult choice: how to deal with defeated Germany to prevent a recurrence of the horrors of Nazism. Each had a different vision for the future. Churchill considered dividing Germany into 3 parts, Roosevelt into 5. Only Stalin spoke of the idea that the country should remain one. Since the issue could not be resolved, it was shelved for the time being. The next discussion happened in Yalta. Once again, there were different plans, with the most radical coming from the US Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau. His plan proposed the complete dismantling of German industry and transforming Germany into an agrarian society. In the author's view, Germany should have been deprived of all resources for waging war, including heavy industry, becoming entirely dependent on other countries. Essentially, the plan suggested that Germany should permanently lose its power and capacity for aggression. Although the plan was rejected, it demonstrated how seriously the Allies were considering how to make the world safe from a new German threat. Nevertheless, a more moderate approach prevailed, and the Allies decided to use less harsh but still strict measures to reorganize Germany. The main principles of this policy were incorporated into the Potsdam Agreement, signed in 1945. It was decided that Germany needed the so-called 4 Ds: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. These measures were intended to completely reshape German society. Demilitarization aimed to eliminate any military ambitions. Denazification sought to purge public life of Nazi ideas. Democratization was to lay the foundation for a peaceful and free state, and decentralization was to weaken the centralized power that had previously supported the dictatorship. In the end, they agreed on 3 occupation zones, and then on 4, after carving a French zone out of the British and American zones. From the French zone, the French themselves later carved out the Saar Protectorate, intending to one day annex it. The former capital of Germany was also divided into 4, but de jure, the city was still considered as one. This is roughly where all our problems began. Each of the 4 occupying powers had its vision of Germany's future and sought to bring about that future in its own way. Previously advocating for Germany's partition, the United Kingdom and the United States agreed that it would be better to have a single country. The Soviet Union also held a principled stance on this, emphasizing that sooner or later, a final peace treaty would have to be signed. although there was currently no one to sign it with. Does this mean that since everyone favored a united Germany, it would eventually be unified? Not quite. In the 3 years following the victory, relations between the former allies had deteriorated significantly. One of the reasons was the conflicting plans for Germany's future. The USSR aimed to build a socialist state with a planned economy in the eastern part of the country. As reparation, the Soviet authorities actively removed factory equipment from the occupied territory. Western countries had no need for German machinery. They wanted reparation in monetary form, which required creating a solvent state with a market economy from the ruins of the Reich. In February 1948, a conference of 6 powers, France, the UK, the US, and the Benelux countries, began in London regarding Germany's future. The Western Allies and neighboring countries planned to revive Germany as a democratic federal state, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG. In response to this discourtesy, the head of the Soviet military administration in Germany, Marshal Sokolovsky, issued an order temporarily closing the borders of the Soviet zone. The western sectors of Berlin were cut off from supply routes, forcing the Allies to deliver provisions to their troops by air. This so-called small blockade lasted several weeks. The western sectors of Berlin, comprising about 2/3 of the city's territory, were not to Stalin's liking. In the middle of the Soviet occupation zone, which he considered his territory, stood a capitalist enclave defended by what were nearly hostile troops. The Soviet leadership tried to negotiate an exchange of West Berlin for some territories located at the borders of the occupation zones. The Allies did not relent, as the enclave's situation quite suited them. In 1948, Berlin was only formally divided into sectors of occupation. Residents were often unaware of the borders drawn amidst the city's ruins, freely moving from sector to sector. The population of Berlin at that time was just under 3.5 million people, with 2.4 million living in the western sectors. There was almost no work, and the residents were primarily engaged in clearing the ruins. Scarce food supplies were rationed, and it was only through the ration cards that Berliners knew which sector they lived in, as each occupation zone had different cards. The overall city administration was carried out by a unified command, which included representatives of the 4 allies. On June 16th, Major General Kodakov withdrew from the Allied command due to political disagreements. Berlin began to strain along its intersector borders. On June 20th, the Allies implemented a currency reform in their occupation zones without notifying the USSR, replacing the old Reichsmarks with new Deutsche Marks. Germans could exchange only a limited amount of money, and the flow of leftover old banknotes threatened to flood into Eastern Germany. On June 23rd, the Soviet military administration also conducted a currency reform and additionally closed the border. A major repair of the railway and highway connecting Berlin to West Germany was urgently undertaken. Although no repairs were made on the rivers, river transport was also blocked. Simultaneously, the supply of electricity from the power station located in East Berlin to the western part of the city was cut off. The blockade of most of Berlin began. The Allies could maintain contact with the capital only by air. Tempelhof Airport was located in the western part, supplying the essential needs for the 20,000 American, British, and French troops in Berlin posed no significant challenge. But in addition to the military personnel, the blockaded part of the city also housed 2.4 million Germans. The remaining food supplies in Berlin, even with rationing, would last for only 36 days, and the fuel needed for energy production would last for 45 days. US President Harry Truman, caught up in an election campaign, declared, "Above all, we must restore a sense of security and stop the Soviet threat." The salvation of starving Berlin became a central theme of his campaign. However, while it's easy to rally people with slogans, how could the blockade realistically be broken? There were some hotheads. The head of the US military administration in Germany, General Lucius D. Clay, suggested breaking through to Berlin with tank units. Yet everyone understood that this could lead to the beginning of a Third World War, which nobody wanted. Truman limited his response to deploying 60 heavy bombers with a secret cargo to England. It was assumed that these bombers could carry atomic bombs, which the USSR did not yet possess. This somewhat cooled Stalin's fervor, but he did not consider lifting the blockade of Berlin. The Soviet leadership understood that it was impossible to feed such a large city by air, and expected that the starving Berliners would eventually plead for sustenance, and that the Allies would hand their sectors over to the USSR as a burdensome and useless load. The Allies began considering the possibility of supplying Berlin by air. They counted on the Soviets not daring to shoot at the planes, as, formally, the air corridors to Berlin remained open. The British, who had been rationing food at home for nearly a decade, started making calculations. It was necessary to provide more than 2 million people with a daily ration of 1,700 calories. Even if most of the food were in the form of powders or dry bricks, their total weight would amount to 1,500 tons per day. Additionally, 2,500 tons of coal needed to be delivered daily to Berlin for electricity production. The American C-47 transport plane could carry only 3 tons, necessitating 1,333 flights per day. The task seemed impossible, but the process commenced. The first flight carrying food from Frankfurt to Berlin took place on June 23rd, and the number of planes in the air increased daily. Berliners anxiously listened to the roar of aircraft engines over the city, as this sound primarily associated with the bombings of 1944 to 1945. But now, the planes were bringing life, not death. The spirit of the Berliners was lifted by Mayor Ernst Reuter, a man with a colorful biography. In 1917, he was captured by the Russians, joined the Bolsheviks, and served as a commissar in the Volga region. He then returned to Germany, became a communist, a socialist, and spent time in Nazi prisons. In early 1948, Reuter won the mayoral election, but the Soviet administration did not recognize his victory, so he became the mayor of the 3 western sectors. After the blockade began, Reuter declared on the radio, "Berlin will not become the next Soviet city. We will do everything to stop the USSR and not become slaves to a one-party system." General Clay consulted with Reuter about whether the citizens could endure a drastic reduction in rations. The mayor replied, "You take care of the planes and I'll take care of the Berliners." On June 26th, Allied planes delivered only 90 tons of flour, egg powder, dried potato puree, and coal to Berlin. 2 weeks later, daily deliveries increased to 900 tons, which was still 4 times less than the minimum needed. The flights were poorly organized. Planes were idling on the runways for a long time, and collisions during takeoff and landing had begun. The first casualties of the Soviet blockade appeared, and they were among the American pilots. A clear system for the airlift was needed. General William Tunner took charge of this, arriving in Berlin on July 28th. He already had similar experience, as during the war, he organized air supply over the Himalayas to Chiang Kai-shek's army in China. Under Tunner, Operation Vittles gained clear logistics. 3 air corridors were utilized. Planes flew into Berlin via the southern corridor from Frankfurt and the northern one from Hamburg, returning via the central corridor to Hanover. In the air, planes occupied 5 levels, with pilots seeing 2 planes above and below, and 2 more to the left and right. Landing was allowed only 1 attempt. If the pilot could not land on the first try, they would return unloaded. Tunner declared that he needed a precise rhythm like an African drum, and planes began landing at Tempelhof every 3 minutes. They were unloaded in 7 minutes and remained on the ground for no more than half an hour. Pilots received coffee and hot meals right on the runway. Thanks to Tunner's efforts, the initial plan was achieved in the autumn. By October, there were 1,500 flights a day, carrying up to 4,500 tons of cargo. The USSR could not disrupt the air supply to Berlin, but in response, it intensified its propaganda. Radio from the eastern sector constantly reminded Berliners that the planes flying over their homes today were the same ones that had bombed their homes not long ago. The Allies were accused of supplying their own occupation troops, leaving only meager scraps for the city's residents. The organizers of the blockade were outraged by the greediness of those trying to break through their blockade. Additionally, the administration of the Soviet sector actively encouraged Westerners to re-register their ration cards in East Berlin, promising them better and uninterrupted supplies. Announcers repeatedly reported the arrival of another train with grain in Berlin and the allocation of 55,000 liters of free milk for the children of those who would move from the western sectors to the eastern one. Berliners were largely skeptical of Soviet propaganda. Throughout the blockade, fewer than 100,000 people re-registered their cards, accounting for only 3.8% of the population of West Berlin. In response to the propaganda, Reuter initiated the construction of another airfield, Tegel, with a runway that 18,000 Berliners, half of whom were women, built in a record 90 days. During the clearing of the site, they demolished a radio tower that interfered with the planes, which was used by Soviet radio. This weakened the power of communist propaganda. The Allies' position was further strengthened by the events of September 9th, when a massive rally took place at the Brandenburg Gate. In his speech, Reuter voiced the fears of Berliners that the Western countries might sell them out to the Soviets. People of the world, people of England, France, and America, look at this city and you will understand that its inhabitants cannot be left in distress. Someone from the excited crowd tore down a red flag at the border of the Soviet sector. In response, Red Army soldiers opened fire. One young man was killed, and several people were injured. This all seemed so outrageous compared to the hospitable calls of radio propaganda that trust in it dropped almost to zero. The Americans won the love and trust of Berliners in a very different way. Pilot Gail Halverson noticed children crowding along the fence of Tempelhof Airport. He took a small packet of candy, wafers, and raisins from his rations, tied a handkerchief to it, and, during his landing approach, tossed this little parachute out the cockpit window. The children's excitement at catching the gift from the sky was immense. Halverson began to drop sweets every flight. Other pilots followed his example. Berlin children started calling their planes raisin bombers. Soon, this name stuck to all the planes flying the airlift. When one of the Berlin newspapers wrote about Halverson's bombing, the story was quickly picked up by the US press. Initially, many donations were sent to the airbase from American children, asking for sweets to be bought with the money and sent to Berlin children by parachute. Then, confectionery companies joined the project, now called Operation Little Vittles, supplying Germany with ready-to-go packages of sweets with attached parachutes. The raisin bombings became widespread, eventually winning the hearts of little Berliners. In November, the weather over Germany worsened dramatically. There were many non-flying days, but on the days that flights could occur, the intensity of air transport increased sharply. It was necessary to deliver as much fuel as possible to the freezing Berlin. Pilots were working to exhaustion. In addition to the pilots from the USA and Britain, aviators from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa joined, but there were still not enough crews. They had to call upon former Luftwaffe pilots, several dozen of whom took the controls of planes of their recent adversaries to sustain life in blockaded Berlin. Nonetheless, in January 1949, the rations distributed by cards were smaller than they had been in January 1945. Infectious diseases broke out among the weakened population, and the mortality rate increased. In January 1949, British planes began airlifting the most weakened children from Berlin to Western Germany. The Soviet administration began to realize that its blockade attempt was failing. The Allies had proven that they could support life in their sectors indefinitely. Moscow did not dare to interrupt the airlift, but tried to hinder the constant flights as much as possible. Soviet fighters interfered with the air bridge traffic. Demonstrative exercises of the Air Force, air defense, and airborne units were conducted near the corridors. At night, Soviet searchlights scanned the sky over Berlin, blinding the pilots on approach. American Ken Slater made a forced landing in the Soviet zone, and a real hunt was launched for him. Only with the help of local residents and smugglers was he able to make his way to the west. By March, the weather improved, and the airlift was once again operating at full capacity. The latest transport aircraft, the Globemaster C-74 and Stratofreighter C-97, capable of carrying 25 tons of cargo each, arrived from America with these planes and the efficient organization of flights. On April 16, 1949, General Tunner set a record. In 24 hours, the airlift planes completed 1,383 flights, transporting 13,000 tons of cargo. The USSR never saw Western Berlin fall into its hands due to blockade fatigue or hunger. Stalin realized the futility of continuing the city's blockade. On the night of May 12th, as if by magic, repair work on the railway tracks and highways, which had lasted 10 months and 23 days, was completed. Supplies began flowing into Berlin again over land and by river. Planes continued to deliver cargo to Berlin for several more months, but the airlift gradually decreased its operations. Over the duration of the airlift, 2.34 million tons of cargo were transported. The delivery was costly. Victims of the Soviet blockade included not only Berliners who died of malnutrition and disease, but also 101 pilots who perished in air crashes, including 40 British and 31 American aviators. The Berlin blockade ultimately resulted in the complete and final division of Germany and its capital into democratic and socialist parts. In 1949, a new state, the Federal Republic of Germany, was established in the Western Tri-Zone, while the Soviets created the German Democratic Republic in their zone. In Berlin, clear boundaries emerged between the western and eastern sectors, which a decade later turned into a concrete wall that the Germans themselves dubbed the Wall of Shame, known to us as the Berlin Wall. The situations generally developed in parallel. In the West, a Western democracy was being built, as American diplomat Acheson put it, while in the East, an Eastern one was formed. For the sake of appearances, everyone claimed to support German unity, but the reality was quite different. The United States pointed to the achievements of West Germany in restoring peaceful life and asserted that unification should mean joining the Federal Republic of Germany. Within West Germany itself, the question of priorities loomed large: integration with the West or unification with the East. The ruling Christian Democrats favored the former. In the East, they broke away from the idea of a unified administration for Berlin because independent Social Democrats were gaining traction there. In response to the gradual establishment of the West German government, the government of East Germany, dominated by communists, began to emerge. The Soviet side continued to insist most strongly on the unity of the country. Sometimes the notion of the USSR conditionally agreeing to a unified but neutral Germany is cited as an example of Stalin's peaceable nature. However, there are points to consider. At the same time that Foreign Minister Vyazhinsky insisted that the USSR consistently implemented a policy aimed at ensuring democratic peace and friendly cooperation among nations, the same Soviet Union was making territorial claims on Turkey to lands they had voluntarily renounced almost 30 years prior. This doesn't exactly smell of peaceableness. Secondly, in the event of a union of a conditionally neutral Germany, there was no guarantee that local communists wouldn't stage something akin to what happened in Czechoslovakia or Hungary, namely, a soft coup through trade unions, internal affairs forces, and other non-systemic entities. As early as April 1945, even before the end of the war, German communists were secretly sent to the Soviet occupation zone to organize party work. Moreover, even in the case of the most honest elections, the inclusion of the eastern lands in the all-German electoral process would likely benefit the leftist forces. Even the unification of Germany on a neutral, non-aligned basis would have been advantageous for the USSR. It would be advantageous at the cost of the existing sphere of influence, but still better than a new NATO member. The status of Finland, which remained neutral throughout the Cold War, was quite acceptable to the Soviet Union. Thus, there is no Soviet peacefulness here, only cold calculation, which is characteristic of any policy. Accordingly, in the West, the prospect of creating a unified, neutral Germany was viewed completely oppositely. First, there was the possibility of a repeat of the Czechoslovakian scenario and the loss of the entire country. Second, the Western powers had more to lose than the USSR. Finally, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, was already actively engaged in European integration, and its participation in this project was very important for everyone else. Even after this, and after the blockade of West Berlin, few understood that the division of Germany would last a long time. Both on a personal level and among politicians, hope lingered that the separation would be short-term. This hope strengthened for the last time after Stalin's death. but then it faded again. Thus, the Germans, like the Koreans or Vietnamese, became chess pieces in the hands of the real players, the USA and the USSR. It is evident that the division of Germany affected not only its geography, but also its culture, politics, and economy. People living on different sides of the Berlin Wall experienced various advantages and disadvantages of life in each system, capitalist and socialist. In the FRG, actively supported by the USA and Western Europe, the economy began to boom thanks to the Marshall Plan. Market principles were introduced in the West, and the standard of living and citizens' incomes rapidly increased. Stores offered a wide selection of goods, and cars became a symbol of the Western lifestyle. By the 1960s, most families in the FRG could afford a car and regular vacations, and West German homes were equipped with the most modern appliances and technology. As one former FRG resident recalls, life in capitalism in the West provided the opportunity to grow and strive for more, allowing for a sense of freedom of choice and prospects. However, life in the FRG also had its downsides. Despite the economic boom, unemployment was a significant issue, especially in the 1950s and 1970s. Not all residents could find stable work, and constant economic reforms and high living standards led to tension. Periodically, there were disturbances in the West, as the market economy, in addition to opportunities, created its own risks. Losing one's job could become a real trial. Moreover, high rental prices and constant pressure for productivity caused feelings of anxiety for many. Although stores offered a wide variety of goods available to West Germans, many felt that life demanded constant competitiveness. Social inequality also became increasingly noticeable, and not everyone could afford housing in major cities where real estate prices were rising. It's also worth mentioning the discontent among farmers in the FRG, who, despite assistance from the Marshall Plan, faced issues with market competition. In an open market environment, farmers had to withstand pressure from large agro-industrial companies and meet high standards and requirements, making their situation unstable. Many complained about unfair prices for agricultural products and insufficient government support. One farmer recalled, "While our competitors were growing, we had to work day in and day out just to stay on the brink of survival." On the other hand, the GDR followed a socialist path, emphasizing social justice and equality. The state guaranteed free healthcare and education, supported high employment levels, and offered affordable housing. The unemployment rate was practically zero. Everyone had a job, and even young specialists were guaranteed employment. According to a former resident of the GDR, if you wanted to work, there was always an opportunity to get a position and earn a living. The GDR also had a developed system of kindergartens and schools, and its athletes won many medals at the Olympic Games, raising the country's prestige on the international stage. For example, the GDR team, in terms of the number of awards, stood on par with larger countries, and this success became a source of great pride for citizens of East Germany. However, life in the GDR was not just about social guarantees, but also about shortages. Stores were often empty, and the selection of goods was strictly limited. Typical were queues for essential goods and basic household items. The West, on the contrary, attracted people with its abundance and variety. Clothing, electronics, food, all were easily available in Western stores, contrasting starkly with the everyday reality of the GDR. As one Western politician said, "Freedom of choice and abundance are what attract people to the West, not just ideology." In the GDR, its own culture and traditions were also forming. For example, the children's cartoon Sandmännchen became a symbol of childhood for East Germans and remained popular for many years. The idea of community and equality led to strong social connections among people in East Germany, which was a foundation of life for many citizens. Despite the stringent state control, residents of East Germany could rely on stability, housing, employment, healthcare, and low food prices. Nevertheless, the allure of the West remained powerful. Even with state propaganda claiming the superiority of the socialist system, many East Germans saw on West German television a way of life that was entirely different, where freedom and opportunities attracted many. This contrast eventually became one of the reasons for the mass escape of GDR citizens to the West, before the Berlin Wall was built in 1961. The wall, constructed as a symbol of division, was described by Western leaders as a barrier to freedom. But for the GDR leadership, it was a necessary measure to protect socialist society from Western influence. While the GDR spoke of ideals of equality and common justice, Western leaders emphasized the values of freedom and personal choice. For example, the Chancellor of the FRG, Konrad Adenauer, stated that freedom and responsibility are the main principles that define our society. On the other hand, in the GDR, ideas were spread that guaranteed work and social support are the keys to true happiness. Despite all the differences, both sides continued to hope for reunification, but each envisioned this reunification in their own way. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and two worlds that had been divided for decades were reunited.